Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our first annual Claremont Garden History Lecture Series. We're very, very happy to have so many of you come and join us today because we think this will be a wonderful talk. My name is Alice Stanley Dervin, and I'm the principal here at Claremont Fancourt School. If you've had the opportunity to look around the house and grounds a little bit, I'm sure you'll agree that it is a wonderful, wonderful blessing for every one of us who work here and for the children who go to school here to just experience this environment every single day. We are all very aware that having this wonderful site brings with it the responsibility also to care for the house and the gardens. And our school is very, very much committed to making sure that we retain and restore and improve in keeping with the site. So we've done lots of work on it and will continue. You can see from the lines here that we're in the process of restoring this building, this room, to its grandeur. We're also very committed to learning about our site because that's one of the ways, of course, that we improve and take care of it. And so we have the opportunity today to do just that. We're going to learn about historic gardens. I'd like to introduce David Regal. David and his wife Barbara have been the main organizers of this event, and we greatly appreciate their love for the school and their interest in historic gardens. And then David will introduce our speaker.
Well, isn't this something? Many of you probably have gotten an email from me, and I really appreciate seeing you here today. Welcome to what we hope to be at least an annual lecture on garden history. Claremont, what a place for us to sort of center ourselves as we carry on this conversation that we're hoping to have. And I think this is just what I had in mind. Just what I had in mind. Some of you already know Professor Mowl of the University of Bristol. He's a popular and prolific author and speaker, well known to both garden history scholars and the public. Although garden history scholars often are part of the public. His ongoing project, Historic Gardens of England, supported by grants from the Levenhulme Trust, is modeled after Sir Nicholas Pevsner's Buildings of England. Upon completion, the nationwide project will present historic landscapes and gardens in separate texts, county by county. 10 books have already been published to date. Professor Mowl is an engaging speaker with a long-standing interest in the cultural context of designed landscapes, the people who designed and lived in what are now considered historic buildings and gardens. We have after Professor Mowl's talk, we'll have a question and answer session, and we hope it's as lively as we can make it. Okay. To keep thoughts, though, clear, I'm going to pass these cards around for you to make notes on, and if you'd like, write out questions, and then during the Q&A, we'll have them passed up. Okay.
Now you must be very careful with your questions because we're being videoed, all right? And I shall have to be very careful with my language, won't I? Particularly as quite a few people in the audience have either been taught by me or are being taught by me, and it's lovely to see them. But it's a great privilege for me to be here at Claremont in a county that I haven't yet managed to deal with, although Jill Leggett's here in the audience, and we'll probably have a talk about things I could do in Surrey when I'm finished the 34 others or the 33 others. One of the big problems about this Leverhulme project that I'm doing is that I started far too late. Pevsner started in the 51, I think, and he finished England in 1974 with Staffordshire. But then, you know, he spent about 6 weeks doing each book in the first ones, and I tend to spend about 6 or 7 months doing each of mine. But now I'm very fortunate in that I have people to work with me, funded by the Leverhulme, and so we're doing it a bit quicker, but not as quickly as I might like. At the moment, I've got 2 books to write before Christmas. And teaching and everything. But that's great. That's what one wants to do. But this is, in true Blue Peter fashion, this is one I did earlier on William Kent. It's brilliant, isn't it, doing a biography of someone that you rather despise in many ways, or at least you think is a bit of a drunkard, not a terribly good architect, but quite a clever and intelligent gardener. I'd done a couple of biographies before, one on Horace Walpole, one on William Beckford. Walpole I really disliked, even though he was really quite an exciting commentator on the 18th century. But he was so bitchy, I mean really bitchy bachelor. And then of course I had Beckford, and of course Beckford was an absolute liar. Actually suggested that he'd done quite a lot of Mozart's little arias. And I wanted to call the book Composing for Mozart, Life of William Beckford, and of course the publisher wouldn't allow that. It had to be a Life of William Beckford, Composing for Mozart. But you know Non puis Andrai, don't you? Da 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 da. Beckford claimed he'd actually done that and not Mozart, but there we are. With William Kent, it's quite difficult to pin him down. It's not difficult to pin him down in terms of landscape gardening, which is what we're here to look at today, but it's very difficult to pin him down in terms of his character, because he left very few letters, and those letters that we have got are generally begging for money from Italy. So it's very, very difficult to get his character dealt with. Anyway, some of the slides in this presentation have got quotes, which I will read out. Not all of them have, so you'll have to bear with me. This is William Kent by Benedetto Luti, very heavy, jowly Kent, still in Italy in 1718 before he comes back to England. And I love this Thomas Robinson quote. Robinson, nasty piece of work. Yorkshireman, dangerous person, Robinson. The signor, as he was called, often gave his orders when he was full of claret, which from the context could hardly have been at the dinner table, and suggest therefore an all-day intake of alcohol. And he did not perhaps see the work for several months after. He had indeed a pretty concise, though arbitrary manner to set all right, for he would order, without consulting his employers, 300 or 400 pounds of work or more to be pulled down, and then correct the plan and bring it to what it ought to have been at first. And this is absolutely typical of Kent. He's drunk a lot of the time, he's not quite sure in terms of architecture what he's doing, and then goes into a fit of pique and wants to rebuild things. We ought to give you a little bit about his history first. One of the best books to have been written in the last 10 years is by Fiona McCarthy, and that's the biography of William Morris. I don't know if any of you have read it. And the first thing that she says in that book, which is very much what I believe in, she says that you have to go to places to find the people. And I've had a wonderful tour of the house here with Pamela, thinking about all the people that have been in this house and have made this house what it is. And so I thought, I've got to go to Bridlington. I'm going to switch sides, and I'll come back to you, don't worry. But I like switching sides. Oh yes, coalition government, isn't it? And I thought, I'm going to have a fun time in Bridlington. This is what research should be. And I am going to stay over, and I'll have a lovely time. So anyway, I go to Bridlington thinking, it's a lovely place on the East Riding coast, and I'll have a great time. It's an absolute hellhole. Have you ever been to Bridlington? Goodness me, I've never seen so many shell suits in my life. Oh dear. But Bridlington Old Town is wonderful. And that, of course, is where William Kent grew up. His father, William Cant, C-A-N-T, lived in Bridlington Old Town, and this is where he probably went to school, at the Bale, on the left at the Priory Church, and on the right, the left is the gatehouse of the Bale, where the grammar school was, and on the right is the Priory Church, where I think Kent might have got an inkling of the Gothic. Now, of course, the title of my lecture tonight is Subverting the Palladian, the Gothic urge, the eclectic urge. And there are real heroes tonight and real villains. And one of the main villains tonight is Lord Burlington, and we'll come more to that. He's the guy that created a Palladian straitjacket for Kent, that Kent was trying desperately to burst out of most of his life. Anyway, I've got to go over here, haven't I? Because it won't work unless I do that. Yeah. So off I go to Old Town. I go to Bridlington, and I find this rather interesting late 17th century facade on one of the earlier houses. And if you forget everything you hear tonight, don't forget this. Always trespass and always go round the back of buildings, because that's where you find excitements. So I went round the back of this building through a little alleyway, and I found the date stone that his father had put up. Can you see it's W-E, C-W-E, and a little heart. And that's William Kent and his wife, and a heart to show how together they were, that he had done this facade in the 1690s. And then I looked down, and looking down, I saw this in the courtyard. And I thought, yes, that's Kent. Now, you see, the whole point about being a biographer is you have to capture your subject. And I found it very difficult to capture Kent because of all of these rather odd letters that were written in bits of Italian and bits of English. He had terrible dyslexia. There's no doubt about it, he was dyslexic. And I looked at this, and a woman came out of the door, and she said, "Ooh, you like my gnome then, do you?" And I said, "Yes, it's a wonderful gnome." And I said, "It reminds me of William Kent." And she said, "Well, who's he then?" I said, "Well, he lived in your house." "Oh, did he? That man Kent?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "But when he went to London, he felt he had to be a little bit hoity-toity, and so changed his name to Kent." "Oh, right." So we had this lovely chat. And then I started to look at William Kent's staffage. And there was the key to the man's mind. You only had to look at these wonderful drawings, most of them done in sepia, as you can see, for the garden buildings that he was designing for various people. On your right is one of the Chiswick designs for the obelisk and the gate in the gardens at Chiswick. And if you look very carefully, you can see that there is a man that's lolling in a drunken stupor, because of course it's midnight, and he has a pallet by him, and there are rabbits dancing in a circle. That's Kent, okay? Are you getting him? It gets better. Watch this. This is more Kent staffage. It's great to have it up here. You can all see it, can't you? Who's got the popcorn? On your top left, you've got to work out who he is. And of course, nobody had actually worked out until I did this book, who Kent was in all these drawings. And of course, the thing that's the giveaway is the staff. So Kent is always the man with the staff. So on your top left, you have Kent with his staff talking to one of the noblemen, which of course would be Burlington, and there is a little lapdog pissing on Burlington's ankle. Can you see that? And then on the right, there's Kent, just done a bit of designing in the garden, and he's taking a relief against the wall, and so is the dog taking a relief, cocking his leg. And then who would actually design a cold bath? Of course, we've seen this fantastic cold bath here, the plunge bath. Who would design a cold bath in the terms of a Roman pantheon, which you can't see just out of shot, and actually have semi-naked men lolling about as if they're in some calidarium or frigidarium? And then on the right is the most important of all Kent's staffage, and that is, as you can see, a satyr kissing a shepherdess hand. Remember that. There'll be a test, okay? You're doing Q&A, I'm doing a test. Now, that gives you some idea of how you try and get into the mind of someone that I think probably did more than anybody to create this rather loosening of nature that went on in the 1730s, on which that garden is symptomatic of. Also, let's forget Queen Caroline. Women have a terribly bad press, don't they, in the 18th century? They're rather dull people that do very little. They do sort of silhouettes, and they do rock and shell works in grottos, and that's about all they do. Not a bit of it. We need a lot more work done on women in the 18th century, and Caroline is absolutely central to what was going on in the gardens in the 1730s. But I'll come back to that. First of all, I've got to try and explain this sort of weird thing that happened to Kent. When he's 15, he decides to go down to London. He doesn't want to become a joiner, a cabinet maker, like his father, and he gets down to London, and he's within a circle of East Yorkshire lawyers, who of course have connections down in London, and he becomes a limner, someone that's actually doing legal documents and doing the decorations and the calligraphy for legal documents. And someone spots him. We think it's probably a man called Burrell Massingberd. Most of the early letters are from Kent to Burrell Massingberd asking for money when he's in Italy. And they decide that he's going to be a second Raphael, which is a bit of a joke, really. And they're going to send him to Italy to become this great artist. Remember, artist. He's not at this stage an architect or a landscape designer or an interior designer, certainly not a garden building designer. He wants to become a painter, a history painter. And he goes to Italy, and he is taught by Giuseppe Chiari, who is a purveyor, basically, of acceptable soft porn in Italy at the time. I mean, look at the left hand. You can see what I mean. It's very acceptable. It's usually got a mythological theme, and it's a good way of getting some bare breasts up on your wall. On your right is Kent Ditchley in Oxfordshire, where he was working in the 1720s when he came back from Italy. And you can see, if you look very carefully at it, that almost everything in the two Kent pictures up there are dead ringer copies for Chiari's work, but really bad copies. I mean, I have never ever seen a woman with a waist that wide. Have you ever seen a woman with a waist that wide at the top? And can you see how very similar the helmeted man is to the one in the Hokum picture? So Kent does all this copying while he's in Rome. But at the same time, we find out from these letters between him and Burrell Massingberd that he's actually very interested in odd things, in eclectic things, in things that aren't classical, in things that are nothing to do with art or painting. He raves about Piazza in Venice. He raves about the Duomo at Siena. And he's interested in John Talman, who he's actually gone to Italy with, in all of the exciting designs and drawings that Talman is bringing back. Very Catholic and very eclectic. This is a Talman design for a Gothic hall for All Souls, Oxford, that was never built. But you can see how weirdly eclectic it is. So San Marco, the Duomo, and Talman's influence, Catholic influence on him, are great when he's in Italy. What he doesn't do is he doesn't see any of these. He's not interested in classical architecture. He's not interested in Palladian architecture. He's not going to be the man that's going to come back and be able to build Chiswick for Lord Burlington, because he's not interested in architecture, certainly not in purist neoclassical architecture like these by Palladio. Come on. Ooh. What he does do, and again very few people know about this, is that he does this Church of the Flemings in Rome. And it's fresco work. It's extraordinary how you have an Englishman there trying to be an artist who can create this. Now, it's not very good, but in terms of the technique, it's quite brilliant for someone to be able to do this. So in 1718, he's already done this, St. Julian of the Flemings, in Rome. And then comes back swaggering back to London, dressed like this. Pamela's just shown me this. She's just got a picture of it for the school. And this is William Aikman's portrait with those lovely red shoes, looking rather sort of fat around the waist and very self-satisfied. And then we have George Virtue. Now, you've got to be very careful of George Virtue because he's a chronicler of the arts of the age, and he's a spiteful man as well. So you have to work with a pinch of salt with him. Mr. Kent became envied and admired above all for this noble lord's, that's Burlington, benefactions to him and interest, and that of Lady Burlington, whom he had instructed in the art of drawing and painting in crayons. So he meets Burlington when they're in Italy. Burlington has got a terrible fever. He goes to Burlington and gives him lovely presents. They have this bond. Burlington hardly sees any Palladian architecture when he's in Italy and comes back to try and, in a sense, spearhead the Palladian revival, knowing nothing about Palladio's architecture. You can see how weirdly Ruritanian 18th century England really was, can't you? And Kent is in the middle of it all. Yeah. And of course, Kent, because he doesn't know much about architecture, and because he hasn't got much taste, and he's really more interested in garish art than anything else, does these appalling interiors at Kensington Palace. I mean, just look at them. They are just awful. Niches of marble and pedestals with statues, gilt with burnished gold, which makes a terrible glaring show, and truly Gothic, according to the weakness of the conceptions of the surveyors and controllers of the king's works, or their private peaks. Burlington gets him the job, he gets the job, and does it at Kensington with these terrible interiors. And it's all wood, painted wood, there's no marble, it's garish colours, it's on the cheap, it's 18th century England Ruritania. That's what we were up to at the time, Kent in the middle of it. And of course he has the effrontery to paint himself right on the wall at the top, looking down with two mistresses next to him. But that's very Kent, isn't it? Are you getting him? Now, one thing interesting about Kent is he's brilliant on patterns. People who can't do likenesses are good generally on patterns. By the way, the king wouldn't sit for him. He was the king's painter, but he wouldn't sit for him because he couldn't do a likeness. I mean, fancy having the king's painter who can't even paint the king. But what he can do is very, very interesting interiors, based on what he's seen in Rome, and based on French engravings of the time. If you look at the Jean Bérin on the right, and you look at the Presence Chamber, Kensington, on the left, that's probably the best thing in Kensington, and it looks very much like the sort of Raphael neo-classical decorations that Raphael was doing in Rome particularly, but it's very close to French designs at the time. Remember, he's a copyist. He nicks things. He's a magpie. And this is a very interesting quote, 1732, in conversation with a French bookseller. He wonders what's the matter with the English, but his observation has been, we are 100 years behind them always. I think for a Frenchman, he's in the right. Of course, they hate French. As for what you and I do, it may be esteemed 100 years hence, but at present does not look like it. And that's fascinating because most people thought that Kent's work was pretty awful at the time, and we tend to revere him now. I mean, one of the great things, again, about doing a good biography, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that I'm a good biographer or the Kent book is a good biography, it's just that you've got to be pretty circumspect about your subject, which is one of the reasons why my next biography is going to be Germaine Greer. It is. And this idea of eclecticism is interesting here because this is the great hokum in Norfolk for Thomas Cook. And again, most people don't know quite what this hall is about. It was altered in execution by Matthew Brettingham. Let's just look at the house to start with. You can see it's a typical Palladian tower house in the center, but then we have these very interesting dependencies, these wings either side. And can you see how they move on a series of pediments and shouldered pediments? Think about the lodges at Claremont, which are by Kent. And you've got the shoulders, yeah? And it basically comes from the Red Torre, Palladio's church in Venice. But they're very interesting dependencies. Now, you might ask why there are 4 of them. Well, that's because, of course, he did this great big marble hall and a repository of the arts in the middle, and, of course, they had nowhere to live. So they had to have the dependencies to somewhere to live. But this is typical of not only Cook, but Kent's conception. Most people haven't really worked out what that hall is about, but that hall is basically Olympus, because there was an enormous statue of Jupiter meant for it that was over 8 feet high, and it was meant to stand on those steps there. I don't know if you remember the advert with Desmond Lynam coming down with a red carpet. Well, it was in this hall quite a time ago now, and where Desmond Lynam starts on the top is meant to be Jupiter. And of course, Jupiter was dismantled and broke up into pieces and put in the conservatory, but they have found his head. So it was the Hall of Jupiter. Wonderful, wonderful neoclassical conception. Long, long before Robert Adam came back from Rome and started Italy and started doing fantastic things like Kedleston. Yeah. But then, of course, you've got these terrible, terrible tables that are obviously based on Roman tables, both early 18th century and antique early 18th century, that he'd seen when he was in Rome. It's interesting, the Ditchley one has lots of shells on the bottom. So again, you've got this fascination with eclecticism again. But it's terribly, terribly garish and over the top. Now, what's clever about Kent is that he can be working for the king as part of the Office of Works because of Burlington's patronage, but he can also be working for the opposition because, of course, Prince Frederick, Prince of Wales, was very much in opposition to his own parents and had his own separate court. So Kent does this extraordinary state barge for the Prince of Wales, as you can see. Now, you can't call that Palladian, can you? You can't. I don't know quite what you can call it. There are mermen at the front. There are bare-breasted mer women. There is a sort of a Palladian little canopy in the middle, but it is a wonderful, wonderful confection, which survives, as you can see, at Greenwich. But at the same time, he's doing a very interesting garden at Carlton House with that temple, which is yet another bagno, a bathhouse. And the garden at Carlton House is particularly interesting because it's very, very formally laid out on a great big axis with the bagno at the end of it. He has these wings of trees, which is basically what he does, which are a mixture of deciduous and conifers, and you punctuate each section of them by urns or terms or herms. But then, interesting at Carlton House, there are lots and lots of island beds. Almost as if Humphrey Repton had come along and done all these awful island beds around about 1800. And trellis as well. So island beds, trellis, but then this long axis. Now this is interesting because it effectively means that in the 1730s, you're still hanging on to formality, but he is trying to soften it by bringing more flowers into the garden and also bringing height with trellises. So fascinating things going on. Again, he's trying to roughen up the mix of not only architecture, but also garden design. Are you all with me? You getting it? Yeah. This is an interesting excursion. He wants to go Gothic. And there's lots of reasons for this. One of the reasons is San Marco. One of the reasons is that, he's interested in native Gothic, probably because of Bridlington, but also because he doesn't want to be a Palladian. His problem is that his main patron is an absolute lunatic for music and very little else. Burlington wasn't really interested in architecture. He was just interested in music and art. Most of what he saw and did on the Grand Tour was to do with music and art. And so you've got this man coming and thinking, right, well, I've got to impose Palladianism on the 18th century, and I've got this malleable man, William Kent. Kent doesn't really want to be a Palladian architect. Kent wants to do stuff like this. And this is the exciting stuff. This is Gothic with a K. So top left, Westminster Hall, Court of the King's Bench. Bottom right, Gloucester Cathedral screen. Top right, the York pulpit. And bottom left, a candlestick. Again, in sort of weird eclectic fusion. And you can see there's elements of classicism and elements of Gothic in all of them. It's this eclectic urge that Kent is more interested in than anything else. And what happens then when we look at this eclectic urge and we then transplant it to gardens? And who is the person that's driving this? Is it Kent or is it the patrons? Now, all those years ago, I did that book, Gentlemen and Players, Gardeners of the English Landscape. I thought that was quite a good title, actually, because Gentlemen and Players, lords, the professionals and the amateurs. Publishers didn't understand what I was talking about. And I said, well, no, it's a good title. First book I did was Trumpet at a Distant Gate. And it went to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and they said, is it about music? And I said, no, it's about gate lodges. Oh, you can't have that title. So I did. It didn't sell, interestingly. And now I've had to change the title of Gentlemen and Players because you can't get it on Amazon. You can't Google it on eBay or Amazon, and it doesn't come up properly. So they said, could we call it Gentlemen Who Garden? And I said, no. And they said, could we call it Gardening Gentlemen? And I said, no. Why don't we call it Gentlemen Players? Because nobody can find it. I couldn't give a monkey's, I said. So they've called it Gentlemen Gardeners. So when it first came to me as proof, they said, we'll call it Gentlemen and Gardeners, and we'll say, the men who recreated the English landscape garden. And I said, so was there a landscape garden before they then recreated it? Oh, didn't they do that? This is what any publishers in the room? So we had to come to a compromise. Gentlemen gardeners, the men who created the English landscape garden. Then I looked at the blurb. Now, I split an infinitive quite a lot. I quite like it. Dylan Thomas split infinitives almost all the time to brilliant effect. But I try not to use cliches. I counted up the cliches in the blurb that they'd done for the book. There were 17. And the last one was, an Englishman's garden truly is his castle. How about that? So I got my agent to rewrite it. We had one cliche to satisfy them. Anyway, when I wrote that book, Gentlemen and Players, all those years ago, 10 years ago this year, it was published, I was trying to make a point about who really created the informal garden, the Arcadian garden, the templed Arcadia that we've got outside. And I have a sneaking suspicion that Caroline probably had a lot to do with it. Now, there was a very interesting conversation between lords and ladies of the period with Pope in about 1719, 1717. I'm not going to go into it now, but I talk about it in the Kent book. But come the 1730s, Queen Caroline, as she then was actually doing a brilliant garden at Richmond, which of course became Kew. Now, recent scholarship has suggested that Kent, who didn't get there until the 1730s, was not laying out the first garden, and I'll come to that in a minute. But what's significant is that when he did get there in the 1730s, he created two incredible garden buildings that everybody talked about. One of them they thought was good, and one of them they thought was a bit of a joke. Oh, and on the right is the embarkation of Cythera. It's a Watteau painting, and it's an engraving based on that Watteau paving, but showing in the background all of these garden buildings that Kent put around Richmond Park. Now, the important thing about this is it doesn't look like an Arcadian garden, does it? It doesn't look a bit like an Arcadian garden. There's loads of fields for a start. There's loads of fences. And that's, of course, because George II loved to shoot partridges. And, of course, in the early 18th century, all gun stock was very heavy, with very long barrels. So the only thing you could do was shoot things on the ground. So grass, grouse, and partridge. But, of course, once they perfected very small guns, very light guns, with lighter stock, they could do the art of shooting flying. Then you get pheasants. So it goes sequentially like that. So at this point, you can only shoot them on the ground, so you've got to have lots and lots of fields to have the coverts, so you can do that. But of course, what's happened here at Richmond is that you've got 5 mini wildernesses. Can you see them? I won't point them out, but you can see 5 little areas of bosky foliage with wiggly paths. And these are where, of course, Kent was to site a lot of his garden buildings, some of which you can see around this Roke engraving. The 2 important ones are the one on the left, which is the Hermitage, and the one on the right, which is Merlin's Cave. Both gone, of course, completely. Now, this is probably the most important quote in the whole of the talk. And this is the Earl of Egmont, 1734, talking about Caroline. I told her flatterers were fools, for generally princes see through it. True, said she, and therefore it must be done very gently and fine. Soon after which Sir John Rushout, telling her that we owe our best taste in gardening to her, she replied, yes, indeed. I think I may say that I have introduced that in helping nature, not losing it in art. So you have to help nature and not lose it in art. Now, you could say, well, this just means that, if you lose it